183 years ago, in an isolated plantation in Alabama's Black Belt, court records and military documents mentioned a case so disturbing that it ended up buried in silence. Margaret Whitmore, a wealthy widow who inherited over 200 enslaved people, vanished from official records after 1842, but not from the oral memory of the community. The absence left deep scars, marking generations with a silent trauma that is only now beginning to be revealed. In the shadows of the grand mansion that still stands today, witnesses speak of nights when the boundaries between power and exploitation became even more blurred than usual. What began as whispered rumors among enslaved families became a conspiracy of silence that involved judges, lawyers, and local authorities, a silence that lasted more than a century and a half. The truth about Margaret Whitmore's reward system and what really happened in the main house during those Alabama nights of 1842 has finally emerged from hidden courthouse archives and testimonies that were too dangerous to speak aloud during the antebellum period. This is a story about absolute power, systematic abuse, and a web of complicity that reached the highest levels of Alabama society. Chapter 1. The Widow's Inheritance. 183 years ago, in an isolated plantation in Alabama's Black Belt, court records and military documents mentioned a case so disturbing that it ended up buried in silence. Margaret Whitmore, a wealthy widow who inherited over 200 enslaved people, disappeared from official records after 1842, but not from the oral memory of the community. The absence left deep scars, marking generations with a silent trauma that is only now beginning to be revealed. Before continuing, subscribe and activate the bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Margaret Whitmore became one of Alabama's wealthiest plantation owners overnight when her husband, Colonel James Whitmore, died of fever in the summer of 1841. At 28 years old, she inherited not only the grand mansion overlooking the Alabama River, but also one of the largest enslaved populations in the county, 217 human beings whose lives were now entirely in her hands. The plantation records from that period, discovered in the Alabama Department of Archives only in 2023, reveal a woman obsessed with control and systematic documentation. Every aspect of enslaved life was recorded in her leather-bound journals: work assignments, food rations, punishments, and what she euphemistically called special services. But it was the entries marked with a small star symbol that caught historians' attention. Entries that appeared exclusively next to the names of young men between 18 and 25 years old. What made Margaret Whitmore different from other plantation owners was not just her gender, but her methodology. While her late husband had relied on an overseer to manage daily operations, Margaret dismissed him within weeks of taking control. She would personally inspect the quarters every evening, carrying a small notebook and accompanied only by her personal bodyguard, a freed slave named Samuel, who had served the family for over a decade. The enslaved community quickly learned to recognize the sound of her boots on the wooden walkways that connected the quarters. Children would hide, women would lower their eyes, and men would stand perfectly still, knowing that any movement could draw her attention. But what they feared most was not punishment, it was selection. Margaret had established what she called a merit system. Those who exceeded their daily quotas, who showed exceptional skill in carpentry, blacksmithing, or fieldwork, would be rewarded. The rewards ranged from extra food rations to better clothing, but the highest reward, the one that terrified the community, was a night in the main house. Local courthouse records, sealed for over a century, reveal that by November 1841, 3 enslaved men had already been reported as missing from the plantation rolls. The official explanation was escape attempts, but no pursuit parties were organized, no rewards offered for their return. They had simply vanished from the records as if they had never existed. The pattern that would define 1842 was already emerging. Margaret Whitmore had discovered that absolute power over human lives could be exercised in ways her husband had never imagined. The plantation was becoming a laboratory for her darkest impulses, and the enslaved community was beginning to understand that survival would require more than just physical endurance. As winter approached, the entries in Margaret's journal became more frequent, more detailed, and infinitely more disturbing. The star-marked names began to appear not just weekly, but nightly. And in the main house, behind curtains that blocked out the Alabama moonlight, a system of reward and punishment was taking shape that would shatter lives and create secrets too terrible for any official record. Chapter 2. The Merit System. The enslaved quarters of Whitmore Plantation stretched along a ridge overlooking the cotton fields. 32 cabins arranged in precise rows that allowed Margaret to observe every doorway from her bedroom window. Each morning at dawn, she would appear on the mansion's second-floor balcony with her brass telescope, surveying her human property like a general reviewing troops. Samuel, her freed bodyguard, would stand beside her with the daily assignment ledger, reading aloud the names of those selected for fieldwork, house duties, and what Margaret had begun calling special projects. The enslaved community had learned to decode these morning rituals. Field assignments meant safety in numbers. House duties meant closer surveillance, but also access to information. Special projects meant uncertainty, and for some, it meant never returning to the quarters. The merit system Margaret implemented was deceptively simple. Every enslaved person had a weekly quota: bales of cotton picked, acres plowed, meals prepared, or repairs completed. Those who exceeded their quotas by significant margins earned points in Margaret's ledger. Points could be exchanged for privileges: an extra blanket, a visit with family on another plantation, or a day of rest. But the highest tier of rewards required a different kind of currency. Joshua, a 22-year-old blacksmith whose skill with iron had earned him recognition throughout the county, was the first to receive what Margaret called the ultimate reward. His exceptional work repairing the plantation's machinery had caught her attention in December 1841. The journal entry, discovered among sealed court documents, describes the night with clinical precision. Jay summoned to main house, reward granted, performance satisfactory, will repeat arrangement weekly. But Joshua never spoke of that night to anyone in the quarters. When he returned the next morning, his silence was absolute, his demeanor changed. The other men noticed his haunted expression, the way he avoided eye contact, the trembling in his hands that persisted for weeks. Yet Joshua continued to work with the same exceptional skill, perhaps even more desperately than before. The pattern established with Joshua became Margaret's template. Young men who demonstrated exceptional abilities, carpentry, metalwork, even literacy, would find themselves elevated above their peers through the merit system. But elevation came with a price that none of them could have anticipated. Samuel, the freed bodyguard, served as both messenger and enforcer, delivering the summons that no one could refuse. Word of the arrangement began to spread beyond the plantation boundaries through the network of enslaved people who moved between properties delivering messages, hauling goods, or accompanying their owners on business. Other plantation owners' slaves would whisper about the strange system at Whitmore Plantation, where exceptional work led to privileges that left men broken and silent. Local authorities, when they heard the rumors, chose deliberate ignorance. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell, whose own plantation bordered the Whitmore property, had business relationships with Margaret that made investigation inconvenient. The county judge, Harrison Mills, owed the Whitmore estate significant money from failed land speculation. The web of economic dependency that characterized Alabama's planter class ensured that certain questions would never be asked officially. By early 1842, Margaret's journal contained the names of 7 men marked with the star symbol. The entries became more detailed, more systematic, documenting not just the rewards, but also the methods of ensuring silence. Those who participated in the ultimate reward system found their families suddenly granted better quarters, improved food rations, and protection from the harshest punishments. It was a form of collective complicity that bound entire family units to secrecy. The enslaved community developed its own coping mechanisms. Mothers would pray desperately that their sons would not excel too visibly. Skilled workers learned to moderate their productivity, deliberately making small mistakes to avoid standing out. But Margaret's attention was not easily diverted. She had discovered a source of power that transcended even the absolute control traditional slavery provided, and she intended to exploit it fully. Chapter 3. The Chosen Ones. Spring of 1842 brought an intensification of Margaret's system that would have horrified even the most hardened plantation owners of the era. The journal entries from this period, sealed in courthouse vaults until their discovery in 2024, reveal a woman who had moved beyond mere exploitation to what can only be described as systematic predation. Now I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching us from and the exact time you are listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Thomas, a 19-year-old whose literacy had earned him the position of record keeper for the plantation's cotton production, became Margaret's most frequent selection. Unlike Joshua, whose silence had been absolute, Thomas showed visible signs of the psychological toll. His handwriting, once precise and elegant, became increasingly erratic. His productivity, paradoxically, increased as he seemed to drive himself toward exhaustion as a form of escape. The system had evolved beyond simple rewards. Margaret began implementing what she called competitions among the enslaved men. Those who showed exceptional skill would be pitted against each other in various tasks. Who could repair machinery fastest, who could craft the most precise woodwork, who could demonstrate the most advanced literacy. The winners would face a night in the main house. The losers would receive standard punishments, but also a temporary reprieve from selection. Samuel, the freed bodyguard, began keeping separate records of these competitions. His role had expanded beyond mere messenger to active facilitator of Margaret's system. Court documents suggest he received significant compensation for his complicity, land grants that would make him one of the few black property owners in the county. But the price of his cooperation was facilitating a system that destroyed the men he had grown up alongside. The psychological warfare Margaret employed was as sophisticated as it was cruel. She would deliberately select men who were fathers, knowing that their compliance was ensured by threats to their children. Michael, a 24-year-old carpenter whose 3-year-old daughter lived in the quarters, found himself summoned repeatedly throughout the spring months. His wife, Sarah, noticed the change in him, the way he would stare at nothing for hours, the nightmares that left him screaming in his sleep. Other plantation owners began to notice changes at Whitmore Plantation. The productivity was exceptional, but so was the visible trauma among the male population. Dr. William Harrison, who provided medical care to enslaved populations throughout the county, noted in his private correspondence an unusual number of cases involving what he described as nervous exhaustion among young men at the Whitmore property. Margaret's journal entries from this period reveal her growing confidence in the system's effectiveness. She wrote extensively about the power dynamics involved, analyzing the psychological control she had achieved over not just the selected men, but the entire enslaved community. Fear had become her most effective tool. Fear that any demonstration of skill or intelligence could lead to selection. The ripple effects extended beyond the plantation boundaries. Enslaved people from neighboring properties began deliberately underperforming to avoid being sold or transferred to Whitmore Plantation. The reputation of Margaret's reward system had spread throughout the county's slave networks, creating a climate of fear that affected the entire regional economy. Local authorities continued their policy of willful blindness, But private correspondence discovered in family archives suggests that some officials were deeply troubled by the rumors. County Clerk James Morrison wrote to his brother in Mobile, "The situation at Whitmore grows more disturbing by the month, yet no one speaks of it openly. The economic interests are too intertwined, the implications too dangerous for public discourse." By summer 1842, Margaret had selected 12 different men for her ultimate reward system, some repeatedly. The journal entries show increasing experimentation with the arrangements, longer periods of confinement in the main house, and more elaborate forms of psychological manipulation. What had begun as individual acts of exploitation had evolved into a systematic program of abuse that would leave permanent scars on an entire community. Chapter 4. The Breaking Point. By August 1842, the situation at Whitmore Plantation had reached a level of psychological terror that exceeded even the normal brutalities of slavery. Margaret's journal entries from this period, written in increasingly frantic handwriting, describe a system spinning beyond her control, despite her belief that she maintained absolute power. The breaking point came with David, a 21-year-old whose mathematical abilities had made him invaluable for calculating crop yields and managing the plantation's complex financial records. Unlike the others, David possessed something that made him particularly dangerous to Margaret's system. He could read and write well enough to document what was happening. His selection for the ultimate reward would prove to be Margaret's most catastrophic mistake. David had been secretly keeping his own records, hidden in the spaces between the walls of the quarters where he lived. Using charcoal and scraps of paper stolen from the main house, he documented not just his own experiences, but also the testimonies of the other selected men. His writings, discovered during renovation of the quarters in 1994, but sealed from public view until 2023, provide the most detailed account of Margaret's system from the perspective of those who endured it. The psychological toll on the selected men had begun manifesting in ways that could not be hidden from the broader enslaved community. Thomas, the record keeper, had developed a severe stutter that made his work nearly impossible. Joshua, the blacksmith, had begun deliberately injuring his hands to avoid summons to the main house. Michael, the carpenter, had stopped eating regularly and lost significant weight, prompting concerns even from Margaret about his ability to continue performing his duties. But it was the children who began asking questions that threatened to expose the entire system. 3-year-old children wondering why their fathers screamed at night. 7-year-olds asking their mothers why certain men were no longer allowed to speak during communal meals. Teenage boys beginning to understand what selection meant and living in constant terror of their own developing skills. Samuel, the freed bodyguard, found himself increasingly isolated within the community. His role as facilitator of Margaret's system had made him complicit in the trauma of men who had once been his friends. His compensation, the promise of land and freedom for his own family, began to feel inadequate as he witnessed the psychological destruction around him. Court records suggest he began drinking heavily during this period, leading to errors in his record-keeping that would later prove crucial. Margaret's journal entries reveal growing paranoia about potential resistance. She wrote extensively about the sullen attitudes and decreased enthusiasm among the selected men, seemingly unable to recognize that she had created a community of traumatized individuals, barely functioning under extreme psychological duress. Her solution was to intensify the system, selecting men more frequently and keeping them in the main house for longer periods. The plantation's productivity, despite the trauma, remained exceptionally high, a testament to the effectiveness of fear as a motivational tool. But the psychological cost was becoming visible to outside observers. Dr. Harrison noted in his correspondence that he had never encountered such widespread signs of nervous exhaustion in a single enslaved community. His requests to examine the affected men more thoroughly were denied by Margaret. Local authorities received their first formal complaint in September 1842, not from the enslaved community, who had no legal standing to make complaints, but from a neighboring planter concerned about the moral atmosphere affecting his own property. The complaint was filed by Colonel Robert Hayes, whose plantation bordered Whitmore's eastern boundary. Hayes reported disturbing influences that were affecting the discipline and morale of his own enslaved population. The complaint triggered the first official inquiry into Margaret's methods, though the investigation would prove to be as much about protecting the reputation of the planter class as uncovering the truth. Sheriff Caldwell found himself in the impossible position of investigating a woman whose economic and social connections made prosecution unthinkable, while also addressing growing concerns from other plantation owners about the stability of the entire system. As autumn approached, David's secret documentation had grown into a comprehensive record of systematic abuse spanning nearly a year. His writings reveal not just the physical aspects of Margaret's system, but also its psychological sophistication, how she used family connections, promises of freedom, and threats of separation to ensure compliance. His account would become the most damning evidence against a system that had operated in perfect secrecy until that point. Chapter 5. The Secret Investigation. October 1842 marked the beginning of what would become the most carefully concealed investigation in Alabama's antebellum history. Sheriff Thomas Caldwell found himself walking a tightrope between justice and economic survival, knowing that any public exposure of Margaret's system could destabilize the entire plantation economy of the region. The investigation began not through official channels, but through a series of private conversations between concerned plantation owners. Colonel Hayes had convinced two other neighbors, William Morrison and Judge Samuel Crawford, to join him in addressing what they euphemistically called the Whitmore situation. Their concern was not humanitarian but practical. The psychological trauma spreading throughout the enslaved community threatened to inspire resistance or escape attempts that could affect the entire county. Sheriff Caldwell's position was particularly delicate. His own plantation shared a boundary with the Whitmore property, and his financial obligations to the Whitmore estate created conflicts of interest that made official investigation nearly impossible. Instead, he arranged for Dr. Harrison to conduct what appeared to be routine medical examinations of the enslaved population, examinations that would document the physical and psychological evidence of Margaret's system without officially acknowledging its existence. Dr. Harrison's confidential report, discovered in the Crawford family papers in 2022, provides clinical documentation of systematic trauma among the male enslaved population. His findings included evidence of what he carefully described as nervous exhaustion, characterized by persistent trembling, sleep disorders, loss of appetite, and acute anxiety responses. More significantly, his report documented physical evidence that he could only describe in coded medical language due to the legal and social impossibility of explicit accusations. The investigation took an unexpected turn when Samuel, Margaret's freed bodyguard, began providing information to the unofficial inquiry. His motivations remain unclear from the historical record, but court documents suggest he had become increasingly concerned about his own legal culpability as Margaret's system intensified. His testimony, given in secret to Sheriff Caldwell, provided the first insider account of the system's operations. Samuel's revelations were devastating. He described Margaret's detailed planning of each selection, her systematic approach to ensuring silence through family threats, and her increasing demands for documentation of the encounters. Most damaging was his testimony about Margaret's own words, her explicit descriptions of the power she derived from the absolute control she exercised over the selected men. The investigation faced an immediate problem: how to address systematic abuse within a legal system that did not recognize enslaved people as capable of being victims of crimes against their persons. Alabama law in 1842 treated enslaved people as property, meaning that abuse could only be prosecuted as destruction of someone else's property. But Margaret owned the men she was abusing. Judge Crawford, despite his economic ties to the plantation system, found himself genuinely troubled by the evidence emerging from the investigation. His private correspondence reveals a man struggling with the legal and moral implications of a case that challenged the fundamental assumptions of slave-based society. How could the system prosecute abuse that was technically within the legal rights of property owners? The breakthrough came when David's hidden documentation was discovered during what appeared to be a routine inspection of the slave quarters for fire hazards. His detailed records, written in a careful hand despite the traumatic circumstances, provided the first direct testimony from the victims of Margaret's system. His accounts were precise, dated, and included details that corroborated Samuel's testimony. David's writings revealed the psychological sophistication of Margaret's methods. She had not simply been abusing her power, she had created a systematic program designed to maximize both her control and the trauma of her victims. Her selection methods, her use of family relationships as leverage, and her careful documentation suggested a level of premeditation that transformed individual acts of abuse into what could only be described as a program of systematic terror. By November 1842, the unofficial investigation had accumulated evidence that would have been overwhelming in any other context. But the legal and social impossibility of prosecuting a white woman for the systematic abuse of enslaved men created a situation with no precedent in Alabama law. The investigators found themselves with comprehensive evidence of crimes that the legal system could not acknowledge as crimes. Chapter 6. The Cover-Up begins. November 1842 brought the realization that the evidence against Margaret Whitmore was both undeniable and legally unprosecutable, a paradox that would define the response of Alabama's legal and social establishment. The investigation had revealed systematic abuse, but pursuing justice would require acknowledging legal concepts that the slave-based legal system could not accommodate without undermining its entire foundation. If this story has already captivated you, leave a like. It helps the victim's story reach more people. Judge Samuel Crawford faced an unprecedented legal dilemma. The evidence clearly documented systematic abuse, but prosecuting Margaret would require recognizing enslaved people as capable of being crime victims, rather than merely property. Such a legal precedent would threaten the entire foundation of Alabama's economy and social structure. Crawford's private letters reveal a man torn between conscience and practical necessity. The solution emerged through a series of private meetings between the county's most influential plantation owners. Rather than prosecution, they would implement what they called administrative correction, a system of private justice that would address the immediate problem without creating dangerous legal precedents or public scandal. Margaret would face consequences, but they would be imposed and managed entirely within the planter class. Sheriff Caldwell's role evolved from investigator to coordinator of the cover-up. His position required him to balance multiple competing interests, protecting the reputation of the plantation system, ensuring that Margaret's abuses ended without public exposure, and managing the psychological trauma among the enslaved community that threatened regional stability. His solution was both elegant and horrifying in its implications. The first step was isolating Margaret from her victims. Under the guise of plantation efficiency improvements, Sheriff Caldwell arranged for the transfer of all 12 men who had been subjected to Margaret's system to plantations in other counties. The transfers were documented as routine business transactions, with no mention of the underlying reasons. The men were separated not only from Margaret, but also from each other, ensuring that their shared testimony could never be coordinated. David, whose documentation had provided the most damaging evidence, faced a particular challenge. His literacy and record-keeping abilities made him valuable, but his knowledge made him dangerous. The solution was his sale to a plantation in Mississippi, far enough away to prevent his return, but close enough that his new owner would benefit from his skills. His hidden writings were confiscated and sealed in courthouse records with instructions that they remain closed for 50 years. Samuel, the freed bodyguard, whose testimony had been crucial to the investigation, found his situation even more precarious. As a free black man with detailed knowledge of the case, he represented a threat to the entire cover-up. His compensation for cooperation took the form of a one-way ticket to Liberia, the West African colony established for freed American slaves. His departure was voluntary only in the most technical sense. Margaret's punishment was designed to be severe enough to satisfy the investigators while remaining invisible to the broader community. Her access to the enslaved population was restricted through the appointment of a new overseer, Samuel Crawford, Judge Crawford's brother, who would manage all aspects of plantation operations. Margaret retained ownership but lost operational control, effectively making her a prisoner in her own home. The psychological impact on the remaining enslaved community required careful management. The sudden disappearance of 12 men could not be explained without raising questions, so elaborate cover stories were developed. Some men had been sold for plantation efficiency, others had attempted escape and been sold as punishment, and a few had allegedly died of fever. Each explanation was documented in plantation records to provide official justification for the disappearances. Dr. Harrison's medical reports were revised to eliminate any references to systematic trauma, replaced with vague descriptions of seasonal illnesses and work-related fatigue. His original findings were sealed alongside David's writings, with instructions that they never be referenced in any official capacity. His cooperation was ensured through a lucrative contract to provide medical services to all the plantations involved in the cover-up. The broader enslaved community understood that something significant had happened, but the official silence surrounding the events created an atmosphere of confused terror. Families who had lost fathers, sons, and husbands were given no explanation, no opportunity for farewell, no acknowledgement of their loss. The message was clear: even discussing the disappearances could lead to similar consequences. By December 1842, the cover-up was complete. Margaret Whitmore had been effectively neutralized. The evidence had been sealed, and the victims had been scattered across multiple states. The system had protected itself by sacrificing the individuals involved while preserving the institutions that had made the abuse possible. Justice, as the legal system understood it, had been achieved without any official acknowledgement that crimes had been committed. Chapter 7. The Long Silence. The winter of 1842 to 1843 marked the beginning of what would become over a century and a half of institutional silence surrounding the Whitmore case. The efficiency of the cover-up had been remarkable, but maintaining that silence would require ongoing effort from multiple generations of Alabama's legal and social establishment. Margaret Whitmore's transformation from plantation owner to virtual prisoner was carefully managed to avoid public attention. Her new overseer, Samuel Crawford, implemented changes that appeared to be routine efficiency improvements while actually serving as a comprehensive monitoring system. Every aspect of Margaret's interaction with the enslaved community was supervised, documented, and controlled. The plantation's productivity remained high under the new management system, but the social dynamics had been permanently altered. The remaining enslaved community operated under a shadow of trauma and confusion, knowing that 12 of their members had disappeared, but never receiving explanation or closure. The silence imposed by the authorities created a form of collective psychological wound that would persist for generations. Local authorities developed an elaborate system for managing information about the case. Court clerks were instructed to file all related documents under sealed classifications that would prevent accidental discovery. Lawyers involved in the investigation signed confidentiality agreements that extended beyond their own lifetimes, binding their estate executors to maintain secrecy. The legal system had created a framework for permanent institutional amnesia. The scattered victims of Margaret's system faced their own challenges in processing their trauma while adapting to new plantations, new owners, and communities that knew nothing of their experiences. Thomas, the former record keeper, found himself on a cotton plantation in Georgia where his literacy was valued, but his psychological damage was viewed as laziness or defiance. His new owner's records describe him as formerly productive, but now prone to distraction and nervous behavior. David, whose documentation had been crucial to exposing the case, struggled with isolation on his Mississippi plantation. His new owner, unaware of his history, initially valued his mathematical and record-keeping abilities. But David's psychological trauma manifested in ways that made consistent work difficult. His performance declined steadily through 1843, leading to increasingly harsh treatment that compounded his existing trauma. The families left behind on Whitmore Plantation faced a different form of suffering. Sarah, Michael's wife, never learned what had happened to her husband. The official explanation that he had been sold for plantation efficiency left her with no understanding of whether he was alive, whether they might be reunited, or how to explain his disappearance to their children. Her grief was complicated by the impossibility of expressing it openly. Judge Crawford's private correspondence from this period reveals his ongoing struggle with the ethical implications of the cover-up. He wrote to his brother in Charleston, "We have achieved what we set out to achieve, the cessation of unconscionable behavior and the preservation of social stability. Yet I find myself questioning whether justice that cannot speak its name is justice at all." His doubts, however, never translated into action to reverse the cover-up. The broader Alabama legal community developed informal protocols for handling any future cases that might threaten the plantation system's stability. The Whitmore case became a template for managing systematic abuse through private justice rather than public prosecution. Legal precedents were established not through court decisions, but through confidential agreements and sealed documents. Margaret's own experience of the punishment imposed upon her reveals the complexity of justice within the slave system. While she had lost operational control of her plantation and lived under constant supervision, she retained her wealth, her social status, and her freedom. Her punishment was designed to end her ability to abuse others while preserving the social structures that had enabled her behavior. From her perspective, she had been betrayed by a system that should have protected her absolute rights as a property owner. Local churches, which might have provided moral leadership on the issue, chose instead to reinforce the official silence. Ministers avoided any references to the case in their sermons, and church records from the period contain no acknowledgement of the systematic abuse or its aftermath. The religious community's complicity in the cover-up helped ensure that moral questions about the case would never receive public discussion. As 1843 progressed, the success of the cover-up became increasingly apparent. No public investigation had emerged, no newspaper coverage had appeared, and no legal challenges had developed. The case was becoming what the authorities had intended, a non-event that had never officially occurred. The victims had been dispersed, the evidence had been sealed, and the institutional memory was being deliberately erased. Chapter 8. Generations of Secrets. The decades following the Whitmore cover-up witnessed the systematic erasure of institutional memory, as successive generations of Alabama officials inherited both sealed documents and unspoken understandings about what could never be discussed publicly. The case had established precedents, not just for managing plantation abuse, but for how entire communities could maintain collective amnesia about traumatic events. By 1850, most of the officials directly involved in the investigation and cover-up had died or retired, taking their detailed knowledge with them. Their replacements inherited filing systems with sealed sections, confidentiality agreements without context, and informal protocols for managing sensitive plantation-related cases. The institutional knowledge became increasingly fragmented, while the commitment to secrecy remained absolute. The Civil War brought massive disruption to Alabama's plantation system, but the Whitmore documents survived in courthouse vaults that remained intact despite the broader chaos. The sealed files were transferred from one generation of court clerks to the next, with each transfer accompanied by increasingly vague instructions about maintaining confidentiality. By the 1880s, few officials remembered what the documents contained, only that they were never to be opened. Margaret Whitmore herself died in 1863, taking her version of events with her. Her death occurred during the final months of the Civil War, when record-keeping had become sporadic and attention was focused on immediate survival rather than historical documentation. Her obituary, published in the local newspaper, described her as a devoted plantation owner who managed her property with exceptional efficiency during challenging times. No reference was made to the events of 1842. The scattered victims of Margaret's system faced their own struggles with memory and silence during the post-war period. Those who survived to see emancipation found themselves in communities where their traumatic experiences could not be shared or understood. David, who had documented the abuse so carefully, died on his Mississippi plantation in 1859, never having had the opportunity to speak publicly about his experiences. The Reconstruction period brought new legal frameworks that might have provided mechanisms for addressing historical abuses, but the Whitmore case remained buried beneath layers of institutional secrecy and the practical challenges of post-war recovery. The few surviving victims who might have sought some form of justice were scattered across multiple states, lacking both the resources and the legal knowledge necessary to pursue historical grievances. Local oral traditions among African American communities preserved fragmented memories of the Whitmore case, but these traditions were necessarily incomplete and often coded in metaphorical language that provided some protection from potential retaliation. Stories about the plantation where men disappeared, or the widow who rewarded silence, circulated in limited circles, but always without specific details that could lead to identification or verification. The turn of the 20th century brought new generations of historians interested in documenting Alabama's plantation period, but their research consistently encountered gaps in the historical record surrounding the Whitmore plantation. Academic inquiries about the sealed courthouse documents were politely deflected with explanations about routine confidentiality procedures and incomplete historical records. The cover-up had become so institutional that it operated without conscious effort. Family histories compiled by descendants of both the enslaved and enslaving communities reflected the successful erasure of the Whitmore case. Genealogical research revealed plantation records that carefully omitted the 12 men who'd been transferred or sold, creating genealogical gaps that frustrated family historians but never provided sufficient clues to uncover the underlying reasons for the missing records. The Great Depression brought economic pressures that led some Alabama counties to consider selling historical documents to collectors or universities to raise funds. But the Whitmore files were specifically excluded from any such consideration. Instructions passed down through generations of courthouse staff ensured that certain documents would never be made available for public or academic research, regardless of economic incentives. World War II created new pressures for historical documentation as the federal government sought to compile comprehensive records of American history for wartime morale purposes. But the Whitmore case remained protected by institutional mechanisms that had evolved to operate automatically. Federal historians working on Alabama plantation history found themselves encountering the same polite deflections and incomplete records that had frustrated researchers for decades. By 1950, more than a century after the events, the Whitmore case had achieved the perfect cover-up. A systematic abuse case that had been so thoroughly erased from official memory that even the custodians of the sealed documents no longer fully understood what they were protecting. The secret had become its own institution, perpetuating itself through bureaucratic inertia rather than conscious conspiracy. Chapter 9. The truth emerges. The digital age would prove to be the undoing of Alabama's most carefully guarded historical secret. In 2019, the Alabama Department of Archives and History began a comprehensive digitization project designed to make historical documents more accessible to researchers and the public. The project's scope was ambitious. Every courthouse document, every archived record, every piece of paper in the state's historical collection would be scanned, catalogued, and made searchable through digital databases. Dr. Jennifer Matthews, a digital archivist working on the Montgomery County Courthouse records, discovered the first anomaly in March 2023. Her scanning equipment detected documents within sealed file folders that were not listed in any catalog or index. The folders themselves were marked only with case numbers and dates from the 1840s, with no indication of their contents or the reasons for their classification. The discovery protocol required Dr. Matthews to photograph the sealed documents' exteriors and submit requests to the state archivist for permission to examine their contents. The request triggered a series of consultations with legal experts, historians, and state officials, the first time in over 150 years that anyone had formally requested access to the Whitmore files. State archivist Robert Harrison, no relation to the 1842 Dr. Harrison, found himself confronting institutional secrecy that predated his own position by multiple generations. The files contained confidentiality restrictions that had never been formally reviewed or updated, creating legal uncertainty about whether they remained binding. His decision to convene a historical review committee would prove to be the first crack in a cover-up that had lasted 181 years. The Historical Review Committee's examination of the sealed documents began in September 2024, with committee members required to sign modern confidentiality agreements while they determined whether the historical restrictions remained legally valid. Dr. Sarah Johnson, a specialist in 19th century Alabama legal history, served as the primary reviewer for what would become known as the Whitmore Revelation. Dr. Johnson's initial report, completed in December 2024, recommended immediate declassification of the documents on the grounds that the original confidentiality agreements had expired with the deaths of all parties involved, and that the historical importance of the documents outweighed any remaining legal concerns. Her recommendation triggered a legal review process that would take additional months to resolve. The declassification decision, announced in March 2025, coincided with renewed national attention to historical cases of systematic abuse and institutional cover-ups. The timing proved significant, as the Whitmore case emerged into a social context more prepared to confront uncomfortable truths about American history. The documents were scheduled for public release in June 2025, with full digital availability following additional months of preparation. David's hidden writings, discovered during the 1994 renovation but sealed until the 2025 declassification, provided the most powerful testimony about Margaret's systematic abuse. His careful documentation, written under traumatic circumstances, offered insights not just into individual experiences of abuse, but into the psychological methods used to maintain control over victims and ensure their silence. Samuel's testimony, revealed after 183 years of secrecy, exposed the economic and social mechanisms that had enabled Margaret's system and its subsequent cover-up. His detailed accounts of Margaret's methods, combined with his insider perspective on the investigation and cover-up, provided crucial understanding of how systematic abuse had operated within Alabama's plantation system. The broader historical implications of the Whitmore case extended far beyond individual trauma to illuminate institutional responses to plantation-era abuse. The case revealed how legal systems designed to protect property rights could be manipulated to conceal crimes against human beings, and how networks of economic and social relationships could coordinate to maintain silence about systematic violations of human dignity. Contemporary responses to the Whitmore revelation have focused not just on the historical abuse, but on the mechanisms that maintained its secrecy for over a century and a half. Legal scholars, historians, and civil rights advocates have used the case to examine how institutional silence perpetuates historical injustices and prevents communities from processing collective trauma. The descendants of both victims and perpetrators have faced complex challenges in processing the revelation. Genealogical research has identified family lines connected to the scattered victims, while property records have traced the ownership of the former Whitmore plantation through multiple generations. The case has prompted broader discussions about historical accountability and the responsibilities of contemporary communities for addressing past injustices. Subscribe to the channel to learn about more forbidden and forgotten stories. Thank you for following the case of the Whitmore plantation. We'll see you in the next video.